So I'm joined by Odie Henderson. Welcome, Odie.
Thank you for having me on.
It was in 2013 when you wrote a piece for movie Mezzanine about the films that you watched most times in your life, and The Blues Brothers was number 4 after Blazing Saddles, after Coming to America, and Meatballs. So my first question will be, what was the first time when you saw the film? Because I do know that that was also the first time that you committed some very, very minor misdemeanor. So tell me, please, about your first screening of Blues Brothers and when you became aware of the movie.
Well, I became aware of the movie when my cousins and I went to see something else at the State Theater in Jersey City. There was a poster on the wall, like, for coming soon movies, and it was a bunch of police cars and the Blues Brothers standing on top of them. The Blues Brothers had been on Saturday Night Live maybe about a couple of years prior to that. They were a running kind of musical gig on the Saturday Night Live. They made this movie out of it. We wanted to see it, and it was rated R. And when it finally came out, we went to the State Theater and bought a ticket to see something that was PG rated and snuck in to see the Blues Brothers. We went upstairs, and we got caught. And there was a teenage boy sitting next to us who vouched for us. We didn't know him from a can of paint, but he told them that we were with him so that we could stay. So that was the first time I snuck into an R-rated movie with my two cousins, the first of many, many times. It was much easier to do it at the State than it was at any other theater in Jersey City.
Tell our Polish listeners just 2 more sentences about what R meant. I mean, that was a classification given by MPAA that precluded you from seeing the film if you were not 17, unless...
Well, you couldn't... The actual description is under 17, not admitted without a parent or guardian. So if you were under 17, you needed somebody who was 17 or older, regardless of who they were, to let you in. A lot of times, we would ask the teenage kids to buy our tickets for us. And then we would go in, and usually they let us in if we had a valid ticket. But more often than not, you were supposed to be with someone. They were supposed to sit with you. So the R was restricted us from seeing movies unless we were 17 or had someone that was over 17 with us. It was a very, very seductive rating for a 10-year-old boy.
Okay, so before we will go into why exactly Blues Brothers was rated R, tell me just one more thing about the previous incarnations of the Blues Brothers. What was SNL at that time? You were born in 1970, so you would be 8-9 years old when the Blues Brothers made their debut on SNL. Was SNL a show that your mom, for example, would let you watch easily, or did that require some negotiation?
No, we were able to stay up late on Friday and Saturday. And wrestling, WWF was wrestling back then, would come on at midnight, and then Fright Night would come on at 1 a.m. on Channel 9, where we saw these horror movies. So Saturday Night Live was on 11:30 on NBC, which is Channel 4 in New York, one of the 3 major stations at the time. I mean, 3 networks. There were only 3 networks. And so we were allowed to watch Saturday Night Live because it was on, and we would turn to wrestling or turn to Fright Night. And so I don't think there was an issue. I don't think my parents knew what Saturday Night Live was. I assume they thought it was like The Tonight Show. Something rather tame. And a lot of times I was with the same cousins, so my aunt was a little bit more lenient about letting us watch some of this stuff. I believe the Blues Brothers initially... John Belushi and Stan Aykroyd wore those clothes in a skit with Gerald Ford, who was always played by Chevy Chase. They wore the skit as wore the outfits as CIA agents. This morphed into them doing these musical numbers for the Blues Brothers. I think the first one was in 78. I think the host was Carrie Fisher, which is the reason why she's in the movie. One of the things I remember about that episode is that Carrie Fisher... They did a Star Wars / Beach Party movie, skit. And Carrie Fisher was Princess Leia, and there was like a Frankie Avalon guy, the Beach Party movies for the Polish listeners. They were movies in the 60s for teenagers. They were on the beach and they were having a party. Pretty much that's all it is. Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello were big stars of those movies. And Gilda Radner played Annette Funicello, and I'll never forget this. She said, "I'm Annette Funicello, and these are my breasts," because Annette Funicello was very buxom. So that's the debut of the Blues Brothers. I think they sang Soul Man, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and for our listeners, if you want to see a funny stand-up of those beach movies, there was a movie in the 80s called Back to the Beach, I think, right?
Which has Pee Wee Herman in it. Pee Wee Herman is also in the Blues Brothers.
He's the waiter at the upscale restaurant where Mayor Daley used to eat when he was still alive.
Mayor Daley is dead, so he doesn't eat there anymore.
Exactly. Okay, so tell me, what was that first screening of Blues Brothers like? You would have been 9, right? 10. That was or 10 when you watched it. So, in a way, that seems like a perfect movie for a 10-year-old boy, right?
Well, oddly enough, we got there at the beginning of the movie. So normally when you sneak into a movie, you sneak into whenever it's on. We got there before the movie even came on, which is great. And so we got to catch it from the beginning the first time. And it is kind of the quintessential movie for a 10-year-old boy because it opens with a musical number with James Brown and Church here in Chicago. And then right after that, there's this enormously ridiculous car chase sequence, the first of many. And since this is 1980, car chase movies have been rather popular since the early 70s. Roger Corman had been making these movies like Eat My Dust, and Grand Theft Auto was another one, and Smokey and the Bandit famously. So we loved car chase movies, and we loved the soul music that my parents and my aunts had on records. So this was kind of the perfect combination of James Brown singing a song and then 7 million car crashes. So it was just heaven for us. It was wonderful. We actually got caught by the usher right after the first chase sequence through the mall. Mm-hmm. And the guy told the usher that we were with him, and he got to stay because ushers used to go around with flashlights back then. It was a much different time for movies. They had nothing else to do. So
were there also busting people for, like, I don't know, having sex in the seats or whatever? What was that other, like, usher activity? Well,
the ushers might be having sex in the seats for all we knew. A lot of people smoked marijuana in the theaters, and it always gave me a headache, the smell of it. So they would be chasing people out that smoked marijuana. Other than that, you kind of had pretty much free reign. The only thing that they made them do was to check for little kids at R-rated movies.
Right. Let's have this out of the way and just tell our listeners why on earth Blues Brothers earned that R rating. One of the things that Stephen Katz, the cinematographer of the movie, he said that he wanted to make like a live action cartoon that was, so it seems such a benign movie at its heart. Why restrict it to 17-year-olds and older viewers?
It's a really strange R because there were a lot more movies that were not rated R that seemed to be more nihilistic and violent. And this movie is ridiculous because it's very slapsticky. No one really gets hurt. The Blues Brothers are blown up, buildings fall on top of them, and they just get up and dust themselves off and say, "Oh, we got to go to work." And so it is a live-action cartoon. And the reason why it's got an R is because there were a couple of F words. But I think the bigger reason why it got an R is because it was an R and a movie that was promoting anarchy. And that was the thing that the MPAA, especially, remember, this is 80, so we're about to get Reagan. We're about to usher in this whole era of religious fervor and moral majority nonsense. So I think the R rating, there are enough F words in the Blues Brothers to get an R rating by default. But I think the bigger reason is because they felt that kids shouldn't see this movie because it was promoting anarchy.
Even though the Blues Brothers were on the mission from God, right?
Well, they were trying to save an orphanage, which is, there are so many movies from the 30s and 40s where people are trying to say, well, Mickey Rooney made one of these with Boys Town, about saving the orphanage or these kids. And it's very Catholic, if you think about it. There's even a line the Nazis are against the Blues Brothers because he's a Catholic. So the movie has a very, very kind of moral center to it. But the issue was that the Blues Brothers themselves were, number one, they were singing black music, which, you know, even though we're past race movies, that still was something that people seemed to think was, you know, negative. But also they're just their characters themselves. They'd been in jail. They all had gone to jail. Everybody in the movie mentions jail at some point. And they wound up back in jail. So I think that's the reason why I got the R.
And there was also a brothel scene that was cut from the film, right? The brothers, before they went, I think, to marry the sister Mary Stigmata, they went to a brothel, but that was cut.
Right, that was cut because I think John Landis and Aykroyd, you know, they wanted a movie that kids could go see, or at least smart teenagers could go see. You know, Saturday Night Live was more for teenagers. My slightly older cousins got more out of Saturday Night Live than I did because they got a lot more of the humor than I did as a little kid, you know. So I think that's why. And if you look at the Blues Brothers sequel, which is terrible, it's rated PG-13.
One more thing about the music before we go more into plot, because this is something that also our younger viewers, I think, can miss a little bit. 1980 was a famous year for, or infamous rather, for those disco musicals like Xanadu and Can't Stop the Music. And usually, you know, 1980 is considered this sort of final year, the year that killed off disco in a way. And I was a bit surprised when I found this quote from Dan Aykroyd, who said that that was also one of the purposes of Blues Brothers, sort of, you know, to push away this sort of disco invasion. Some people on the set even wore T-shirts saying, you know, disco sucks, because Aykroyd, who was a huge fan of blues music, felt that, you know, there's all this wonderful blues music that people are not really aware of. Meanwhile, they are, you know, dancing to the Village People or something else. Did you feel that at the time, that this was like a movie that was offering like an other, I don't know, musical avenue or whatever?
Well, we have to take a bigger look at this. First of all, Chicago, which is where the Blues Brothers takes place, is the site of the infamous Disco Sucks rally at Comiskey Park. And Disco Sucks rally was basically a very racist incident where a bunch of white guys who didn't like disco, which is primarily a music of black and Latino gay people, they decided to bring all these records, vinyl records, to Comiskey Park and blow them up on the field. And that was a dumb idea because baseball fields are flammable, for starters. They're grass. But also because they couldn't control how many people showed up. So people showed up, and it was this huge riot, and it was a disaster. Now, the Blues Brothers takes place in Chicago, so there is probably some thought about them wanting to push disco out of this. But disco was on its way out before the Disco Sucks rally. And Cab Calloway, who is he plays Curtis, he plays the guy that helped the Blues Brothers raise the Blues Brothers with Sister Mary Stigmata and gave them their style. They wear the hats and the sunglasses because of Curtis. Cab Calloway had just come out with a disco version of Minnie the Moocher. Now, 80 is also the year of the Ethel Merman disco album, and everybody was taking their last grasp of disco. He wanted to sing that version in the Blues Brothers, and John Landis said, no, I want the traditional version that he sang in the 30s. And I think that may be kind of a key to what you're talking about, how they wanted to kill disco with this movie. The other thing is that no one was listening to any of these people. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, John Lee Hooker, especially. But Aretha Franklin and James Brown were obviously bigger, more well-known mainstream people than, they say, Sam and Dave or John Lee Hooker. So people are on record. Aretha Franklin is on record saying that, you know, this revitalized her career. Of course, everybody was still doing disco songs at the time, except maybe James wasn't doing any. So I think maybe that is true. But they didn't go the direction that the Disco Sucks rally went, where they were saying for rock music was the only music. They went the other direction, where they're saying that rhythm and blues was the only music. So that's an interesting this distinction. The Disco Sucks rally was meant to bring back white music, whereas the Blues Brothers is bringing back an ungodly amount of black talent in music.
That's a great point, and I think also it clarifies, it puts it in this wider context, wider map. As far as the humor in the film is concerned, you mentioned this sort of anarchic, SNL-ish humor that's definitely there. The same year, Airplane opened, yes, which stemmed from this really close tradition of Kentucky Fried Movie, which was actually directed by John Landis. That would have come out later, right, in the year of 1980.
Airplane came out, I'm trying to remember. They were pretty close, maybe 2 months apart, if that much.
How did you sort of compare those movies at that time? Was it you felt that they represented the same kind of sensibility, or were they different? Like what was that like?
Well, we could get in the Airplane because it was rated PG, which was a big controversy because of some of the the humor and there's nudity and everything in Airplane. We were able to get in, but Airplane is different because Airplane goes back to a different tradition, almost a vaudevillian one, where it's a gag a minute, a gag a minute, a gag a minute. And that's different than the Blues Brothers, which is based on more of a situational kind of skit humor, where it's not a joke every minute, where things build or there's characters in it. So Airplane is taking you back to an even earlier tradition of movies like Hell's a Poppin' and movies of Marx Brothers, because they're just basically the plot is completely irrelevant. Basically, to Airplane, it's all about the gags and all about what people are saying and doing and the one-liners. So this is a different movie. I mean, we loved Airplane for a completely different reason than we loved the Blues Brothers. But I really didn't make a connection back then to the types of movies that they were.
Right. You also mentioned in another piece that you wrote, which is wonderful, and I actually recommend it to everyone. That's a piece that you wrote for Big Media Vandalism in 2010. You mentioned that generally SNL movies or movies that stemmed from that SNL, sort of center, were bad. That these movies. So would you say that Blues Brothers is the best SNL adjacent film there is?
It's the first one, and I think it is the best one. I mean, you can make an argument for Wayne's World in some ways, but for the most part, the SNL movies were built upon these characters on SNL. And I remember the Blues Brothers, the SNL has only been on television for 4 years when they started making the Blues Brothers. It came out in 80 and making it in 79. So SNL had only been on for 4 years. They still had the original not ready for primetime players. Some of them left, like Chevy Chase, to do Foul Play and so on, movies he left. Bill Murray went to do Meatballs the year before this movie. So SNL was still in its kind of first stage. Remember, the next year after this movie, SNL collapsed. Lorne Michaels was fired. They brought in Eddie Murphy, but the show was like the worst era of SNL. Happened directly after this film. And when SNL came back, they started promoting these movies and trying to make more money off of them. And we wound up with things like Coneheads, which has Dan Aykroyd in it, and The Night at the Roxbury, that are just terrible. And The Ladies' Man are just bad movies. Wayne's World, I think, is an aberration.
Two more things connected to the black culture that the film depicts. One, there was a controversy even at the time when Blues Brothers, as a band, I guess, released their album, which I think was called "Briefcase Full of Blues." Some people were saying that there were those two white guys who were singing historically black music. In your piece in Big Media Vandalism, you make this point that during the musical numbers, actually Blues Brothers rarely join in, that they give the stage to those iconic performers like Aretha Franklin and John Lee Hooker. Would you say that in the movie, would you say the same thing nowadays after all those years from writing this article?
Well, yeah, because if you look at it, the band that they have, Steve Cropper and Duck Dunn and all these people would have been Stax house band. So, that music, the incidental music you hear all the time, dun, 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 it's I Can't Turn You Loose by Otis Redding. And those guys played on that record. So the Blues Brothers band, Steve Cropper and all of those folks, they were on these songs, and they won in the 60s. So Stax, as Isaac Hayes talked about, was an integrated band of musicians in a time when you really couldn't do that. You know, Motown had an occasional white musician around with the Funk Brothers, but you really weren't allowed to do that. So Stax had an integrated band that kind of became the Blues Brothers band. You see all those guys in the movie, Willie Hall and so on in the movie. But if you watch, the difference between this movie and the Blues Brothers sequel is that in the original movie, James Brown sings the old landmark and the Blues Brothers react. They dance, they see the light. Aretha Franklin sings Think. They dance with Aretha Franklin. You never hear them sing with any of these people. When they sing by themselves. They sing Sweet Home Chicago, and they sing, Solomon Burke's, Everybody Needs Somebody to Love. They're singing these songs on their own. But they never sing with the people. Like, they'll see the spotlight to these stars that they admire very, very much. In the sequel, they made them sing with Wilson Pickett and all of that. And that kind of throws the movie off. And there could be a criticism that's valid about the sequel, but I don't see that here in the original at all.
Mm-hmm. In a recent book by Daniel de Vizay, who wrote a book-long record of making of the movie, he actually mentions, he's from Chicago, by the way, that after seeing the movie for the first time in 1980, he ran to the record store, but he didn't run to buy the soundtrack from the movie. He ran to buy all those, iconic performers. So I guess, would you say that the movie had an effect in bringing those performances back to the spotlight, or simply making people in America more aware of them?
Absolutely. And you see, when you incidental music, the music that's playing on, they have a 8-track of the best of Sam and Dave when they're in the car. They have John Lee Hooker singing on the soundtrack in addition. All these songs from that era are playing. It's almost constant music from the original, Stax and other era of the 60s. And so it does actually bring that back. People were interested in seeing who these people were, hearing who they were, and buying the album. The Blues Brothers soundtrack had these people on it singing the songs, but, they had many albums already. So you can go to the store and see Ray Charles, and he's got like 27, 30 albums by this point. Mm-hmm. Aretha Franklin, same thing. Her career was going down, but she had out songs in 76 and 77 that were hits.
Mm-hmm. There are three things I want to ask, and they may seem very obvious in American context, but I bet that our Polish listeners will need some explanation. So please forgive me if it's too obvious to ask about. But in your piece, you are making a comment on the culinary preference of the character of Elwood Blues. He insists many times in the movie on having white bread, and he actually grills a piece of white bread on a coat hanger on a hot plate in this little flop house where they live over the L line. And you say that the insistence on him having white bread constantly may be a wink towards the black audience in America. Tell us why. Why the white bread? What does it mean?
Well, several times there's the running joke that Elwood is addicted to white toast. He asks for white toast at Aretha's restaurant. When he goes to Ray's, he opens up a toaster oven. You see, he's the only one that doesn't have an instrument. Everybody else is getting an instrument before Ray shows up. He's looking at the toaster oven. In fact, I think he takes a piece of bread out of his coat and puts it into the toaster oven at Ray's store. White bread, Wonder Bread, very famously, the famous white bread here in America. You may have seen it. It's a white bag with different color polka dots on it. White bread was kind of a term for white people, or one of the nicer terms for white people. And so it was a joke that he was so white bread, to use that term. If you were white bread, you were bland, you were just flat, and the whitest thing ever. So I think that's the running joke, is that Elwood, who was kind of the tamer of the two, outside of John Belushi and Joliet Jake, he's kind of the straight man. So he's white bread thing is him like this wink saying, yeah, we know these two white guys are singing these songs, so we're going to let you know that we know.
Right, although Jake, who I would say is the more hip of the two brothers, he has a penchant for fried chicken, right? He orders 4 of them.
And a Coke. Right.
And a Coke, right.
Which is funny because Belushi's, one of his more famous characters on SNL, was the Greek diner guy. And they never had no Coke, Pepsi. So I think there's a lot of in-jokes in the movie that tie back to SNL.
Okay. Second thing I wanted to ask about the experience, because I can bet that 99.9 listeners of this podcast, if they are Polish, went to Catholic church when they were growing up, me included. So when I was, at masses at Catholic church, it was all very austere. It was all very calm. We sang those religious songs, which were more like dirges than anything else. It was very solemn. And here we see a scene in the church, of course, with James Brown. You mentioned it, and there's a very particular moment. You also mentioned it in the text when a ray of sunshine touches John Belushi's character, and he transforms. He's touched by God. Is that a reference to a specific experience that would occur in Baptist church? If I
Oh, absolutely. See, the wonderful thing about the James Brown number is that it's absurd. The choreography, people are jumping up, flying through the air and doing backflips. Clearly they're on trampolines. We just don't see them. People are jumping up in the balconies. And Baptist church, or evangelical church, we have this thing called getting happy, where people supposedly get the Holy Ghost. They start flipping out and screaming and running up and down in church. This usually happens during a gospel music number. I was in the choir, and we would see these people jumping up and down. They'd be dragged out of the church by nurses. And so this was taking it to this obviously ridiculous extreme. My mother said that when she used to go to church, when she'd go down to church in the South, to see her relatives, that people would be jumping up and flipping just like in the Blues Brothers. She said, this is like what church is like when I was a kid. It takes it to a really absurd extreme. And when the beam of light shines through the church window to touch Jolie and Jake, to tell them to put the band back together and sing this black music. The music, first of all, is by Elmer Bernstein. He did that little one piece of music that you hear in the movie. But also, he lights up, and then he flips down the aisle, and he starts dancing with everybody, and it looked just like another person in black church. So I think that was kind of what they were going for. Also, the Old Landmark, the song that James Brown sings, which Aretha Franklin also sang in Amazing Grace, the movie, and on the soundtrack of her album, the most successful gospel album in America. It's a standard of Baptist church. I mean, we sang that song. I can sing you all the call and responses to the Old Landmark. So it's a lot of things coming together, kind of paying homage to the black church. Now, Sister Mary Stigmata is obviously a very, very slightly exaggerated nun. Because when I know lots of people that went to Catholic school. I went to Catholic University, and we had one nun, and she was mean. But I went to a Catholic dances, and the nuns would beat you if you got too close dancing with a girl. So they would actually get in between you. Or they would stick their rulers through, and there's a scene in the Blues Brothers where she smacks both of them with the ruler, hitting them both at the same time. And as a kid, that resonated with me because that actually happened to me. I was too close to the girl, and the nun just pow, 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 pow. That's when I knew I didn't want to go to Catholic school. But yeah, so they make that distinction between the two.
It's the chastity ruler, and I think that for Polish viewers, the Catholic part of the film may be very recognizable. That visit to Sister Mary, and
she floats.
And she floats, and the whole scene is shot like in a horror movie a bit, with those shadows and those creaky stairs. And I keep forgetting the name of the school.
Oh, it was like something orphanage for like wayward boys, something ridiculous.
But like Saint Helen of the Holy Shroud,
yeah, something like that. Saint Helen of the Holy Shroud. We used to joke and say that some of the Catholic schools it should have been called Our Lady of the Evening, but Lady of the Night. Yeah, it's an interesting idea that I think most the orphanages in America were run by the Catholic Church. I know overseas they most certainly were. Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and the third thing I wanted to ask, and then we'll move on, is specifically the Aretha Franklin scene, because we know that when Aretha Franklin first agreed to do the movie, she really wanted to sing her most famous song, which was "Respect." Right. But Landis really, pushed her and said that he wants her to sing "Think." And the thing I want to ask you about in this scene and the song is that I think I intuit that she's portraying this very specific kind of a type of a black woman who is saying something to her husband. She demands to be heard. She really it's like a feminist statement of power, right, in that scene. So can you comment a little bit on that song choice regarding to this Black American womanhood?
Well, that restaurant reminded me so much of black restaurants we had a restaurant called Zimp's when I was a kid in Jersey City that was a soul food kitchen, as they call it. So it's Aretha's Soul Food Kitchen. It kind of looks like what you have, like a diner almost in this particular instance, and you can see the guy cooking in the background, and he kind of looked like Matt Murphy. If you watch I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, Isaac Hayes is playing this particular same kind of black cook. Her character, it's interesting that she sings Think, which is appropriate for the actual scene, but you can see her throwing her authority out, saying either you respect my authority, you need to get out, you need to leave. And, he leaves, but it's not like she's been like dissed by him leaving. She basically is like, okay, bye. If you don't want to be with me, you can leave, which is kind of what Think is about. Respect is kind of the opposite. First of all, Otis Redding wrote Respect, so Otis Redding's Ghost is haunting this movie because all that music and the chase sequences are from the Otis Redding song. But also, it's kind of like it's her restaurant. You keep in mind, you notice that it's her restaurant. He's working for her. And she can get another cook. She ain't another husband, but she can get another cook. But she's kind of saying, listen, at the end of the day, I'm the boss here. And he can't accept that, so he leaves. But I think that's why I think was more important than Respect. But in terms of her, she reminded me so much of so many black women I knew, her authority. I'm just not going to let you walk all over me. You might walk all over me, but I'm a willing participant. Aretha Franklin's one of her more famous songs, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. It opens with her saying, you're no good, you're heartbreaking, you're a thief, and I don't know why I let you do these things to me. Aretha Franklin was known for that kind of song where, I'm still in power, but at the same token, I know that you're no good, but I know, and I'm a willing participant. And I think that shows in her scene in this movie, and even in the sequel, because she's in the sequel as well.
Right. Speaking of Polish elements in the film, because Chicago is a very Polish city, I counted at least two. There's a sign for Polish sausage at Aretha Franklin's place. We actually see when the Maxwell Street scene is introduced, we get this little montage, and there are scenes of the sausages being flipped on the grill. Right. And a brief moment when the brothers are looking for some of them, their band members, and they come to this lady who was, like a landlady for two of them. There's a picture of the Pope. And
yes, I saw the Pope, but was he Pope back then? I guess he was. Pope John Paul II. And Mrs. Tarantino, that's her name. Mrs. Tarantino is the name of the woman in this little brief scene. And I wondered why they included that scene, but it's a good kind of scene that exists by itself, and that it gives you a religious tie, because she says they were good, nice boys. They made too much noise at night, but they were good, clean boys. And she says that right in front of the picture of the Pope.
Right.
And then she gives them the card, and they're singing at the Holiday Inn, these like lounge singers for old people. But it does kind of tie into the whole religious angle of the movie.
Mm-hmm. And also to the working class angle, because when I was rewatching it, I completely forgot that the film opens with those quite lengthy shots of steel mills all over Chicago. And, and this scene also, this is a working class woman, a Catholic, presumably Italian, judging from the last name, with, the picture of the Pope, who, right, by the way, the actual Pope, John Paul II, actually visited Chicago in 1979 when the movie was shot. So, I think that, by leaving this scene in, it's just they left the focus on this working class community that the brothers were part of, clearly.
Right. And also, when the brothers are promoting their show, Cab Calloway sends the orphans out to promote the show, to bring attention to it, and they're driving around bringing attention to it with a giant horn on top of the Bluesmobile, and they're giving out posters. So basically, this is kind of like, and also the blues, most importantly, is music of the poor, of the downtrodden, of the working class, like folk music, American folk music and blues come from that same thing. You know, Robert Johnson, none of the people that sing the blues are rich. And then they didn't get rich because their music was stolen and what have you. But it was never about rich people. They sang about wanting to be rich, but it was always a very working class, very, poor people singing these songs. And the movie is a testament to that. The one scene where John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd go to the really ritzy restaurant, the people that are there are clearly snobs. They don't want them there at all, even though, technically speaking, they have a jacket. You have to wear a jacket at these restaurants, and the Blues Brothers are wearing jackets and hats, and they, look like what is Aretha says, Hasidic jewelry merchants, but they're dressed in a point where they could actually sit in that restaurant. Mm-hmm. They just didn't. The people that were there were making a statement about the commentary about they seemed like a bunch of poor working class people, which they were. Mm-hmm. And that was the only sin that they committed until John Belushi starts being silly. But their mere presence is, an affront. And the whole movie is about that. They want to save the orphanage. So obviously, no rich kids are in the orphanage except for Annie. So it's a very, very, very working. And Chicago is a very, very working class town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it struck me when I was rewatching it that this movie actually is on a, let's say, political level, very critical of the whole, waspy elite, which is no surprise also coming from John Landis. When you think about Animal House, which was made 2 years prior, you had those frat boys, and I may confuse my Greek letters now. There was Delta and Omega, and I think Omega was the waspy, yes, rich boys.
The Delta House is the Animal House,
and the Delta House is the Animal House, and it's all about those quote-unquote slobs from quote-unquote lower classes, giving the finger, sometimes literally, to those upper crust pampered waspy kids. And when I watched Blues Brothers, there's the same streak here. I mean, America shown in this film is quite hostile to anyone who's a minority, b poor. It's there are Nazis in this film.
Yes, Illinois Nazis whom they hate. One of them is played by Henry Gibson. The entire movie, it's interesting because this is Animal House ushered in what they refer to as the snobs versus slobs comedies. Now, keep in mind, think about this. This is not new. The Marx Brothers were slobs versus snobs comedies, though the W.C. Fields movies. So this has a precedent to the earlier times. But Caddyshack came out the same year as the Blues Brothers, 1980, and ushered in this whole era of movies like Easy Money and so on, where people infiltrate these waspy areas, and even if they're white, they're of a class that is very classist in America. And there will always also, at the same time, the exploitation films like Smokey and the Bandit and White Line Fever and Convoy and so on, they were all lower class, working class people, whites and blacks joining together against a common enemy, which in this case was the cops. Just like in the Blues Brothers, the common enemy is the cops. And there's Stephen Williams from 21 Jump Street, a black cop and a white cop in this movie, and that's on purpose. There's the intent of, it doesn't make a difference what color you are. If you are on the side of the law, or if you're on the side of rules, then you are to be mocked.
Mm-hmm. And there's also that's a great comment. And there's also one scene in the movie that's actually a jab on white working class racism, which is the country and western scene, right? We have both country and western, where all it takes is to sing, a couple of bars of blues music to get, pelted with bottles and stuff. Is that also like a commentary? And then they jump into a song which the mere choice of which I think is also a joke, right? Can you comment on this country and western?
That's one of my favorite lines in the movies. What kind of music do you sing? Oh, we have both kinds, country and western. And it goes to the fact that blues and bluegrass and country aren't that far apart from each other musically. Also, who was singing these songs? Hank Williams wasn't rich. and he's singing country music, and bluegrass people were not singing, weren't rich either. So again, it comes from Appalachia, which is poor white people and poor black people as well. So this is all music of people who came from nothing and built themselves up musically, or played a guitar to make dimes or whatever. And they start singing "Give Me Some Lovin'," which actually is a song that was made quite famous by a white artist. It just happened to be an R&B kind of song. And then they jump into singing the theme from Rawhide, which is a TV show that was what made Clint Eastwood almost famous. He was on there. He played Rowdy Yates. It was a Western on TV in the 50s. And then they sing Stand By Your Man, which, if you would think about it, a country Western bar like that would have flipped out because of the gay kind of angle of them singing Stand By Your Man. So they're mocking. Clearly mine. Also, the people get up and jump around as there's chicken wire in front of them. And this is not new. A lot of these bars actually had chicken wire in front of the people. That's where they got the idea to put it in front of them. So they could throw these bottles. Even when they like the song, they're still throwing bottles at the Blues Brothers. So they're just kind of throwing that. And then you have the good old boys chasing them. So there's this whole redneck element that's chasing the Blues Brothers. And these redneck people would be just as poor as Jake and Elwood, but they're on the wrong side of musical history in the mindset because they're racist against black music, race music, as they used to call it.
This is a film filled with cameos, with small roles by very, priceless performance. Unfortunately, some of them gone by now. But do you have favorites among this, secondary cast that sometimes simply, pops up for a scene or two?
Well, there's some very interesting choices here. First of all, John Landis is notorious for putting other directors in his films, including himself. He is in this movie. He is in the chase scene in the mall. And Frank Oz, of course, is at the beginning. But at this point, Frank Oz wasn't a director. He was just a performer for the Muppets. Frank Oz shows up in a lot of John Landis' movies.
That's the scene where he gives John Belushi his belongings,
yes,
including a prophylactic.
Yeah, he's the guard. In both Blues Brothers, he plays this part. And you have Steve Lawrence, who comes from a completely different type of music that would be closer to what Murph and the Magic Tones are playing at the Holiday Inn. He's playing this mafiosi guy in the steam room that's going to hook them up with this gig, which is kind of funny because Steve is not with Edie. Steve and Edie were always together. It's just Steve Lawrence. It was an interesting choice to cast him. You have Twiggy in this movie, and I don't know how famous Twiggy was by this point in time. I had never seen him before as a kid. And you have, of course, most famously, you have Steven Spielberg, who we did know what he looked like because he was on TV fairly often, especially after Close Encounters. He plays the guy who takes their money. And that was a wink from Landis, their relationship with Spielberg, by casting him there. He's eating a tuna fish sandwich. And he's at the last scene when everybody's pointing guns at them. There's a million guns being pointed at Steven Spielberg.
Well, that's a nice touch also, because when the movie was being made, there were all those reports, by the way, factually true, that the budget was ballooning and, it was becoming a really expensive film, and you can see why. And there was some schadenfreude before the film was released because people said, oh, this will be just like Spielberg's 1941, like this big, disaster of a movie.
Which stars John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd.
Yeah, exactly. And people actually in Variety, I think, started to nickname this film before it opened 1942. That it will be like, this. However, it turned out completely differently. Do you remember when you saw 1941 for the first time?
I did. I saw 1941 in the movie theater. It was terrible. But then, even more interesting, the Blues Brothers, how I saw it so many times was that it was on Channel 11 a lot. And 1941 played on Channel 9. These are independent channels in New York that were specific to New York, that were not network television, that were not national, I mean. They ran 1941 uncut because when you run 1941 on television, there was, like the Deer Hunter has the same rule, you couldn't run it cut. And 1941 is PG, and it's rather dirty for a PG movie. Deer Hunter is obviously rated R. And so the second time I saw it was on Channel 9. They also added like 40 minutes to 1941 when they did the TV cut, which is like basically putting hell on top of hell. 1941 is such childish humor that you think I would get it, but I didn't. I thought it was incredibly unfunny. And then 4 years later, the Zucker brothers, which brings us back to Airplane, they made Top Secret, which is clearly a movie that's making fun of World War II movies like 1941 would have been doing, but was actually funny.
Right, and I was wondering because when when Blues Brothers was shown on television, you have this thing also. I probably not anymore in America where films were edited for television.
Yes.
So will there be parts of Blues Brothers that were cut, or will there be dialogue that was replaced?
Well, there would be. The Blues Brothers is too long for a TV slot. It's 2 hours long, and what they would do is they would cut things out, but not things that. I remember the opening where Frank Oz says, "And when prophylactic soiled," they cut that, but at the end of the movie, when his credit comes up, he's holding the prophylactic. They actually had to show that because you cannot cut credits out. Well, now you can speed them up, but back then you had to show that. I remember correctly, there are a couple of the scenes of Carrie Fisher are missing from the TV print, and some of the profanity is missing from the TV print. It's either changed or the line is completely gone.
Right, at the very end of the scene at Aretha's diner, she says shit in the theatrical.
She says shoot, but we knew she was saying shit. Yeah.
One more thing about like the overall meaning of the movie, because I was again struck by this. Some people pointed out to John Landis that actually the whole premise of the film is false because parochial schools are not taxed by the state, right? So the premise of this parochial school having to pay this $5,000 is like false in itself. And he rightly didn't care because nobody who watches this movie cares if it's factual or not. But I think that the film says something about America, and this ties into what we said before, that in a way it's all about the money. That it's a really, the vision of America here is quite cruel. There are those Nazis, there are racist people, there's capitalism who will close this little school if the nuns are not able to pay the $5,000, and it's only by pulling together and pulling together across all those class divisions and race division and giving the show like pulling together and creating this show, this communal experience that actually you can achieve some beauty or success or redemption, as Sister Mary Stigmata would put it. What's your take on this whole money theme?
Well, every organization in this movie is corrupt. The Catholic Church is corrupt because the Catholic Church could easily, remember, Jake says, well, isn't it the church's responsibility? And Sister Mary Stigmata says, well, the church has given up on us. They're going to sell the orphanage for money. This is a very crucial line in the movie that people miss. The church could easily give them the money. And the church wants to sell it to the Board of Ed, the evil Board of Ed, public schools here in America. They want to sell it to them. If you look at everything that happens to the Blues Brothers happens because a person or a small group of people put it together. Steve Lawrence may be the mafiosi, but he is able to get the hall. But they have to fill that hall. So they have to send the kids out. They get everybody to promote it. Every single institution is corrupt. They couldn't go to Daley Center I guess that's the whole visuals of the Daley Center being breached by the military. In 1980 is very subversive. Now, you're looking at that's happening on college campuses here, riot gear to break up unarmed protesters in college. A lot of these visuals are maybe not necessarily ahead of their time, but they seemed extreme in 1980 and seem almost documentary-like now. I think it loses that's how Network loses a lot of its humor, because basically Network is now a documentary as opposed to being a satire on television. The Blues Brothers, it's look at authority. There's that line, the use of unnecessary violence against the apprehension of the Blues Brothers has been approved. So the movie is not giving you it's not subtext, it's text that the institutions are corrupt.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why the film got an R in a pre-Reaganite or almost Reaganite America.
Right. Again, it's anarchy, total anarchy, and we can't have that.
there will always be a measure of sadness watching this film, because we know, in hindsight, that only 2 years after its release, John Belushi died in LA. We also know, thanks to many books that were published afterwards, of how troubled he was. And there's only one scene in the film actually where we see his eyes. Where actually, Carrie Fisher is about to nuke him, and all it takes is for him to remove glasses, and you actually put this screenshot in your piece saying, "Could you say no to this face?" Can you comment on Belushi and his sudden vulnerability? Because we know from off-screen records that he was behaving terribly on the set on this film, and he was not only stoned, but he was barely living, at the time.
Right. And, Belushi, like Chris Farley and other tragic character people, but Richard Pryor even, Pryor was clearly, more raunchy, but again, at the same time, there was a vulnerability to some of these people. You can't do Live on the Sunset Strip and do a 15-minute monologue about you setting yourself on fire without a sense of vulnerability and making it funny. And same thing with John Belushi, he was a better actor than a lot of people give him credit for. He was in Old Boyfriends, the movie that was made before that was written by Joe Tewksbury. He was in Continental Divide, which I think is a very underrated Lawrence Kasdan movie that he did.
He played a Chicago Sun-Times reporter.
He played a Chicago Sun-Times reporter that made me sometimes think of Roger, and just because, John Belushi. And there's comedy comes from pain, and a lot of the most vulnerable comedians are a lot of the most funniest comedians are the ones who are most vulnerable, who had problems that they could not shake. And so for Belushi, I think he knew that he could channel that type of thing. Even with Bluto and Animal House, he's full of anarchy, but at the same time, there's a little bit of a sweetness to him. He's not necessarily a character that's so evil like you would not want to be, around him, even if he is a chaos muppet, And so I think for him, he was able to do that. But your demons eventually get to you, and they got to him, like they got to Chris Farley, like they got to Richard Pryor, and it's other people. But he knows how to do it. And you only see his eyes once, and you see Cab Calloway's. He takes his glasses off once at the end when he's singing Giles Rock. And also when he's doing the Minnie the Moocher number, where it turns into Cab Calloway from 1934 from the movie he made, where he sings Minnie the Moocher. I love that Landis throws that out, even though it's imaginary, because when he finishes the song, you see him back as Curtis. But for that moment, he's the Cab Calloway from the 30s that made me want to have straight hair so I could shake my hair like Cab Calloway.
This is wonderful. Slowly going to the end, also to the end of the movie. I wonder, the ushers at the theater where you watched the film, would they chase you away before the full credits rolled, or were you there to see the iconic, when visiting Universal Studios, Ask for Babs, which ends not only this movie, but I think several other John Landis films, right?
Well, the Universal thing at the end was the original post-credit sequence, and it existed long before the Blues Brothers. But it used to always just say, Universal always promoted their theme park, their studio.
Right. Wasn't it in Animal House when they first used it?
Ever since that screen appeared that said Ask for Babs, it always said Ask for Babs after that, until they got rid of it. Right. They took it off. But it was the original post-credit sequence. And yes, we were allowed to sit through the credits because you don't have to leave. You could sit through the movie 3 or 4 times if you wanted to. We sat through the Blues Brothers twice.
Wow.
So you didn't have to leave when the credits did. Not chase you out. You could sit in the movie theater all day.
I know for a fact that you did go to Universal Studios. Did you ask for Babs?
Well, I went to Universal Studios before Animal House initially. I went to Universal Studios at the time they had a movie called The Car, which I love, which is a car that was running people over and it was driven by the devil. This is 1977. I went to Universal Studios probably between 77 and 78. So Animal House would not have come out yet. So there was no Babs to ask for. But I was at Universal Studios 2 weeks ago, and I asked for Babs. Now, here's the funny thing. It used to be if you asked for Babs, you got into the Universal Studios for free.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. One last question: how often do you come? How many times did you see the film? If it's the fourth on your most watched, how would you say, and how often do you come back to it?
I've probably seen it hundreds of times. Meatballs, I think, still remains the champion. Well, Blazing Saddles, Meatballs, but really funny, quick story. Stephen Boone, who ran Big Media Vandalism, where this piece appears, he told me a story once that Wheezy Jefferson, a.k.a. Isabel Sanford, had come to his neighborhood in Mount Vernon. And the Blues Brothers on Channel 11, and they were like, his sister or somebody from the neighborhood was like, Wheezy is outside, because no one would have called her Isabel Sanford. They would have called her Wheezy. And Boone did not leave his house because the Blues Brothers is on. So he never got to meet Wheezy. And I think that was kind of how you feel about this movie. And whenever it was on, I'd watch it. My cousin Vinny is kind of getting up there now. Whenever my cousin Vinny is on, wherever I catch it, I will sit through the rest of it. And the same thing happened with the Blues Brothers, and it was on fairly often. And it was fun to watch. It's fun. It's musical. It's car crashes. The two things I love about movies. Two of the things I love about movies. So, of course, it was on. We'd watch it. It's long, and it gave us something to do.
So I do hope that next year when the film turns 45, oh my God, and I'm approaching that age as well, that you will get to rewatch it in some glorious print and with great sound, because in this sound is very important.
One last thing. That time I saw it at the movie theater was the only time I'd seen it in the theater until IFC Center in New York ran it at midnight. And I went at midnight. It was the first time I was seeing the movie since 1980 on the big screen. And there were about 14 people in the theater. It was not well attended. But those 14 people were there, and they were into the movie. And there's a shot in James Brown's musical number, which again is the first musical number in the movie that you see someone sing. There's a shot in George Falsey Jr., who edited a lot of John Landis' movies and edited several blaxploitation films. There's a shot of James Brown. He slides across the stage in the church in the movie. But on the screen, he literally slides from one end of the screen to the other. And this is gigantic screen that this is happening in. And I didn't recall that when I saw it in 1980, but I remember that when I saw it at midnight when I was much older. And I just said, damn, it was incredible. He just glided across the screen, almost like Sister Mary Stigmata, but she's coming at you, and he's going across the screen. And I realized just how all of Landis' movies, even comedies like Trading Places, are these beautiful widescreen compositions.
Thank you so much for this. It was wonderful. To our listeners, you can follow Odie's writing in many places. Currently, he's a film critic for the Boston Globe, but you will find his pieces at rogerebert.com and many other places. It's especially a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you live, not over Zoom, and on the premises of the UIC campus, which actually was a place where John Belushi's wife, Judy, was working for a while in the 70s. So she was walking around those buildings. And we are about to take a walk to Maxwell Street, which is actually not that far at all. I think it's like 5 minutes from here. And we will visit the location from the movie, the exterior of a building which actually is not there, sadly, but we will at least visit the hallowed place. And Belushi actually lived nearby, because he lived on Taylor Street, which is again like 2 blocks from here in the Little Italy. If you ever come to Chicago, don't ask for Babs, but find Al's Italian Beef place on Taylor. And right across it, there's a building. I think there's a UPS office right now. That's where John Belushi lived when he was here.
Great. And I'm wearing an Aretha Franklin shirt under this shirt here that I got from the Hall of Fame, from the Grammy Hall of Fame, and it's got Respect on it, and it's an old picture of Aretha Franklin. It's the Queen of Soul.
I will take a picture, and you will see it also on the SpoilerMaster fan page. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Odie.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Perfect hour.
Awesome.
60 minutes.
Perfect. Great.